Hello and welcome to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Today is Thursday, October 25th, and it's also a pleasure to have with us here in the studio today Christina Rainville, who, as many of you know, is running for the position of Bennington County State's Attorney as an independent. The election is coming up on November 6th, so you can already vote if you want. Early voting started, I think, back on September 21st. But you still have about another 12 days or so before you have to go out there and cast your ballots. Anyway, Christina, great to have you with us today. We're eager to hear your views on the issues facing the state's attorney's office. So let's get started by having you tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what motivated you to throw your hat in the ring on this one.
Well, Andrew, first, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm very grateful for the services that GNAT-TV provides to our community. And I'll get to your question about my background, but I first want to address the fact that the current state's attorney isn't here. This was initially proposed as a debate, and it's not a debate because she's refusing to be here. And so the voters are being deprived of the opportunity to compare and contrast the candidates and how we stand on positions, and instead have to watch two separate videos. Her refusal to debate in Manchester and at GNAT-TV ought to be a real red flag to voters. The state's attorney position requires debating on a daily basis. It's a critical skill. The state's attorney needs to be able to debate with judges to make sure cases go the right way. He needs to be able to debate with defense counsel to make sure that plea agreements that are ultimately agreements are reached are in the public interest, needs to debate with witnesses on the stand, needs to debate with the legislature to make sure that laws are enacted that our county needs and that funding comes to Bennington County. The voters ought to be asking themselves, a state's attorney who won't debate, does she have the critical skills necessary to do the job? And that's further a question because of the fact that she doesn't handle appeals and she doesn't do jury trials. And it's a critical skill. It's very disturbing that she's not here to do a debate and that she's refusing to debate. And I think the voters need to think about that. Now, in terms of your question about my background, I went to Northwestern University School of Law in Chicago, which is a top law school. After that, I practiced in Philadelphia at one of the biggest law firms in Philadelphia for 15 years. I became a partner there. And during my time there, I won the American Bar Association National Pro Bono Publico Award, which is among the highest honors you can get in the legal profession. I left there, did public service my entire time, always had pro bono cases at the firm, and then I went to the Securities and Exchange Commission to work full-time in public service. I managed all of the litigation for the 5-state region controlled by the Philadelphia office. And then I decided that our children were doing okay, but I wanted to move to Vermont because I thought it would be a nicer, kinder place to raise children, and I wanted to be a full-time mother. So my husband and I decided to make the move. We had our home in Vermont since 1994, and we moved to Vermont full-time, basically for our kids. And it was a phenomenal decision to make for them. It's a wonderful place, as all of us here know. My first year here, I shelved books in the Jamaica Village School Library. And I'm a workaholic, so I was pretty miserable shelving books in the library, and I wanted to get back into work, so I worked in the public defender's office as a volunteer in Brattleboro. And then I got the job with the state's attorney in Bennington County. I was the chief deputy state's attorney there for 8.5 years. I handled all the toughest cases. I took a case to the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. and won for the county. I handled 25 jury trials, 25 appeals before the Vermont Supreme Court. When a child went missing under disturbing circumstances in Bennington County, I was the one who worked with the state police. I was the one who requested the Amber Alert. I was the one who worked through the night with the state police. I've always been there for Bennington County. I worked very, very hard for Bennington County, and I'll work very, very hard as a state's attorney.
And so currently you're in private practice, law firm over in Springfield?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So what made you think that the time was right to try for the state's attorney's office?
Well, I'm really horrified by what's going on in Bennington County with the opioid crisis. And other things as well, but that's the real motivating factor for me. Someone in my family died of a heroin overdose in 2013, not in Vermont. But there were two opportunities in her situation of the justice system having the opportunity to stop her problem. She was arrested twice for heroin DUI. And the family, we did everything that we could to try to get the state's attorney's office there to treat it not like an alcohol DUI, but for what it is, a very serious emergency, really. And it was treated like a regular alcohol DUI both times, and then she overdosed and she died. The state's attorney's office needs to completely change the way that opioid cases are being handled in our county. We need a drug court so that cases are not allowed to linger on the docket for years while addicts continue to use and while drug dealers continue to deal their wares on our streets. Drug dealing is not a crime of violence, so according to the Vermont Supreme Court definition of violence. So when drug dealers are arrested, you know, our law enforcement officers risk their lives to go in and raid a drug den and arrest people. There's guns there, there's all kinds of things. They go through that trouble, people are arrested, they're arraigned, and they're generally released that same day back into the community, and they're generally selling drugs again that same day. We need a drug court to make these cases time of the essence. In the drug court that I'm anticipating putting in on my first day in office, we'll have every single person seen before a judge within 7 days of their arrest, offered treatment if their problem is addiction, and all of the cases done within 6 months. It's not going to cost anything. It's taking the same cases that we already have, the same judges, the same lawyers, and just saying these cases are our top priority in terms of time because people are dying. We can't let these cases linger for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. We've got to get them done.
It's my understanding that there are drug court cases, drug courts like what you're describing in 3 of Vermont's counties currently. I guess my question is, if that was such an effective technique to expedite these cases, why only 3 out of the 14 or so counties that we have in the state? What stops the other 11 states' attorneys from doing the same thing? If it's at the discretion of the state's attorney, the individual county state's attorney, to do that. I don't
know what happens in other counties. I just know what Bennington County needs. And what Bennington County needs is that these cases, our time is of the essence. We have to make these cases our absolute top priority so that we get these cases dealt with and we get the dealers off the street rather than letting the cases linger on for years and we get people into treatment. Some of the drug courts are complex and they have treatment teams and they have a whole combination of factors and people have to plead guilty before they get into the drug court. What I'm proposing is very simple. We set aside, say, Thursday's drug court day, so that anyone who's arrested over the weekend is seen by a judge on Thursday and offered treatment, and we have the treatment providers lined up and that sort of thing, so that we deal with these cases quickly. I really can't speak about what happens in other counties. You know, every county is different. I think we have a particular problem here in Bennington because we border Massachusetts and we border New York, and we have the drugs coming in from 2 different directions. And so we may need a different approach, but I do know, absolutely, I'm convinced that we need a drug court to get these cases moving much more quickly than they have been.
One of the other, you put out a rather detailed 21-point plan around the opioid epidemic question, and item number 1 is to establish the drug court. A couple of the other points you have mentioned here are kind of interesting as well. You know, to reduce the number of illegally prescribed opioids in Bennington County and give medical professionals free and immediate access to Vermont's criminal database. Don't they already have access to that database if they need it? No,
the way the access works, everyone in the country has access to Vermont's database. You have to pay $30 by credit card, and then under law, you're not allowed to share that information with anyone. And I spoke to the director of the database before developing my plan. Every part of my plan, I've done the research and the work behind the scenes. And he explained to me that this does not exist for doctors because they can't share it. So, for example, if you have a receptionist or someone whose job it is to look up the patient of that day, rather than a doctor just doing it, the doctor couldn't even put it in the medical record under the state law. What we need to do is make sure that there's exceptions for this access to this program, and that it's free and that it's immediate, so that all prescribing professionals, doctors, nurses, nurses who have prescribing authority, psychiatrists, even veterinarians. The FDA has reported that people are intentionally injuring their animals to get opioids from their veterinarians. We need to work with our veterinarians to make sure that they're aware of this going on in the country and are prepared for it, and that they have access to this database. Another essential point of working with medical professionals is to make sure that they have access to the treatment resources as well. Every time a medical professional decides not to refill an opioid prescription, they need to have the resources to help get that person into treatment, because we know that's a time when people often turn to heroin. So it's a combination of working with the medical professionals to give them information that is free and they can get it. We just have to change the law. It does require a change in the law in Vermont to give them that kind of access.
Because I think the original concern was patient privacy, that was protection that motivated making a bit of a wall in between the doctors acquiring that information on that person's criminal background.
Well, it's actually confusing, because the criminal records law allows anybody to look up anyone's criminal record if you pay the $30 charge. You just can't share it.
Okay.
And there are exceptions. For example, Department of Children and Families has an exception. They can look up as they need to. The police, state police, the courts. Adding doctors to this group of people, and by doctors I mean all prescribing professionals, it would cost nothing, and it's a very simple process. It's not giving them access to anything that's otherwise private, because anybody can look up these records. It's just making it free and immediate and giving them the tool of information so that they consider, for example, a factor. Ooh, this patient has a conviction for selling opioid pills, and consider that as a factor in deciding whether to write the prescription.
Okay, I know that opioids are a major part of your platform, if that's the right term. But I guess I was just wondering, what other issues do you see out there in the state's attorney's office that you feel are in need of a change of focus or a change of emphasis beyond the opioid question?
There are many. One area that's of particular concern to me is the practice of giving youth, young people, 18, 19, 20, felony convictions. When I was there, it was the state's attorney's practice to routinely give felony convictions to people in that age group for marijuana possession, for example. Every time you give someone a felony conviction, they generally become unemployable for the rest of their lives. Employers don't want to hire people who have felony convictions. And it's critical that when you make charging decisions, that you make them not just because you can charge it, but because you should charge it. We were all 18, 19, 20 at one point. We all know that people 18, 19, 20 lack judgment. They make mistakes. Should it be a lifelong punishment for possession of marijuana? Now, the legislation has changed. One of the first things that I would do is immediately work to expunge all marijuana convictions that are no longer a crime today, so that we can get these people back into the labor market. But every time you charge one of those cases that way, and the person takes a felony conviction, the reality is that the person is going to be supported by taxpayers for 50 or 60 years. Either they're going to be unemployed and they need resources, whatever they can get from the state, or they're going to turn to drugs because they're depressed, go into drug dealing, turn to crime because they can't put food on the table any other way. It makes no sense to be giving people felony convictions for crimes where they're only hurting themselves. I mean, I'm not talking about crimes of violence. I'm not talking about serious crimes. I'm talking about making people take felony convictions and even misdemeanor convictions where they're not hurting anybody. Victimless crimes, to me, makes no sense long term. And I think it also long term has affected the incarceration rate. And I think if we stop doing that and look at these decisions critically, sending those cases to diversion, not giving people these felonies that are not serving them, they're not serving their community, they're not serving anyone, and they're counterproductive, that we will, over the long term, help to reduce the incarceration rate as well.
And that isn't being done now? Because I thought the the CRJ, Criminal Restorative Justice?
Yeah.
Center for Restorative Justice was one avenue that many folks were being moved into to avoid jail time or prison sentences?
I sat in that state's attorney's office for 8.5 years, and I can tell you that there are countless more cases that I would have sent to CRJ and that I would have sent to diversion than were ever sent.
Okay.
I just don't, and have never thought that it was appropriate to charge an 18-year-old with a felony marijuana conviction. I met a man in Bennington who told me he had a scholarship to college, and he was arrested and charged with marijuana, got a conviction, lost his scholarship, never went to college. That's the effect that these kinds of charges have, and you have to think about them critically and not do them.
Mm-hmm. I was just wondering, you mentioned that you tried a lot of the cases that came before the state's attorney's office back when you were the deputy there, including the one that went to the Supreme Court. Would you continue to want to do that if you're elected to the top position?
Absolutely. I think it's critical to have a state's attorney who is a hands-on, hard-working prosecutor who handles the toughest cases. That's why you want someone who has experience, who has trial experience, who has appellate experience, for all kinds of reasons. You can have a younger lawyer sitting next to you learning how to do it and train the younger lawyers. You can make sound judgments about what needs to happen in these critical cases. If you're not the person trying the case, it's difficult to make sound judgments as to, well, should I settle this case? Should we do a plea agreement? Should we appeal this decision? These are critical things that state's attorneys do in other counties, and I would certainly do it in Bennington County.
What do you make of the recent controversy that erupted around the hate crime situation with Representative Kaya Morris? That was was one of these things that it seemed, anyway, to me, kind of came out of the blue, surprised a lot of people. But then it became a big national story. And one of the really interesting articles I read about that in the wake of that whole situation, when Representative Morris decided not to run again for re-election, then stepped down, was what constitutes a hate crime, and how does one get prosecuted? Do you have any thoughts on that as to what is that line between what is or is not a hate crime and or one that should be prosecuted?
I think, well, first I want to say that what happened to Kaya Morris was despicable. And what was also disturbing to me from what I read in the paper is that the threats against her began and were ongoing for 2 years before the state's attorney had had her hands on the file or had any involvement. Something like that going on in the community, the state's attorney needs to know that day. You can't wait 2 years and let things escalate over 2 years before you do something. To me, that's completely unacceptable. In terms of hate crimes, it's a very complicated issue. It's not a crime in Vermont to threaten to kill somebody. And that's shocking, has always been shocking to me. And I worked with Senator Sears to try to get that changed at one point, and he told me that there wasn't support for that in the legislature. It changed after a DCF worker was killed. The legislature made it a crime to threaten to kill a DCF worker. But we have countless state employees, particularly police officers, prosecutors, who are somewhat frequently threatened, and there's no recourse because it's not a crime. And what's also important about that is because it's not a crime, you can't investigate it because you need probable cause that a crime has been committed in order to investigate it. And I think our legislature needs to broaden that rule, not to throw people in jail, but to at least allow the police and the investigators to investigate these thoroughly to find out, is this a real threat? Is this someone who's mentally ill, who needs help? What are the circumstances here? And that's a critical piece of it that I think needs to be addressed by the legislature before we even get to the hate crime aspect of it, because you need to have an underlying issue, an underlying crime. Remarkably, though, it is a crime under federal law to threaten to kill a public official. So if the requests are over the internet or by mail, the threats, then it becomes a federal crime. And at that point, it should have been handed over to federal authorities, is what should have happened. I don't know enough about the threats to know what they were and what the nature was. But a critical piece of being the state's attorney is to know when the Vermont laws work,
right,
where they have shortcomings and the federal laws are better. And when I was chief deputy state's attorney, that was a frequent issue. For example, I referred child pornography cases to the federal authorities because their law was stronger than ours. You need to know those distinctions and make the referrals.
One of the issues that's bubbled up is the number of folks who are incarcerated from Bennington County. Apparently, we have at least according to some reports, a higher rate than average around Vermont in people who are incarcerated, sent to prison. I guess I'm just curious to know, do you feel like the incarceration rate in Bennington is about what it should be, or should it be more or less?
I can't say. I can speak to the cases that I tried and the sentences that the judges gave in my cases. I was handling the toughest cases, mostly the attempted murder cases, the sexual abuse of children cases. Those sentences that the judges gave in my cases I thought were all appropriate. However, I can also say that the incarceration rate in the United States as a whole is one of the highest in the world. And we ought to work on what we can to figure out why is that and how do we avoid that and what changes can we make. And I think, to me, one of the issues, again, comes back to this idea of giving youth felony convictions, that because they have a felony conviction, they're then unemployable and they go on to a life of crime. How do we stop that process? And I think that's something that if we can stop that process, we can make long-term goals of reducing the inmate population from Bennington County. One of the other questions that came up yesterday when we were talking with State's Attorney Marthage was this issue about driver's licenses, which was kind of intriguing to me. I mean, I guess people who, for whatever reason, lose their license or their privilege to drive for a period of time still may need to go to Rutland for methadone treatment, or Brattleboro, or maybe they just need to get to a job that requires them to drive 10, 20, 50 miles or whatever. And with a couple of points in their license or their license being criminally suspended, they have a problem if they don't have a family member or a friend who could drive them to their workplace or to wherever they need to go. And sometimes, too often I guess, folks take the chance that they're not going to get stopped again and get another, ding on their license there. Is there anything you've thought of that might be some sort of workaround for folks who find themselves in that position? I absolutely do. I've thought about that often because it's a crime of poverty, and that's wrong. It's one thing to suspend someone's license because they have a DUI and it's a matter of public safety. A lot of these people, it's failure to pay a fine. And I think that when we have a situation when someone can't pay their fine, and then there's penalties on top of that, and it gets worse and worse and worse, and so they can never get out of that, and they have to make a decision every day: do I put food on my table for my family, or do I pay this fine? There ought to be a mechanism for people to go into court and say, I can't pay it, and I need to drive. I need to drive to get to work. I need to drive to get my daughter to the doctor. Whatever we all need to drive. We live in an incredibly rural community. It's just not possible. Not a lot of public
transportation either.
Yeah, it's not possible to go through life and not drive, and we need to recognize that. And people, I think the fine should be adjusted based on someone's ability to pay at that point, and that we ought to not be suspending people's licenses and maintaining those suspensions just because they're poor. And that's the reality of what's happening here.
Well, we're just about out of time here, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to make a closing statement of sorts, just to tell folks why they should vote for you come November 6th. So you have a minute or so to tell them that.
Well, I was a very, very hardworking, hands-on prosecutor for 8.5 years. And that's the kind of prosecutor and state's attorney that I'll be. Very dedicated, and I will do whatever is required to advocate for Bennington County. I was also honored by the governor for my work with the legislature in changing the law to better protect children. The governor came to Bennington and honored me at a public bill signing ceremony. all of this is in addition to trying cases, taking a case to the U.S. Supreme Court. That's the kind of state's attorney that I'm going to be, a leader, someone who looks at what are the problems facing the community, someone who's out in the community, talking to people. I've been talking to people for 3 months now, learning as much as I possibly can about what's involving and affecting the people in our community, and what can I do as state's attorney to fix it. And I will keep that dialogue going because it's critically important to be accessible to the community as well. So I promise to the voters that I'm going to work night and day on the opioid crisis. I'm going to work night and day to be fair to defendants, to be fair to victims, and to work in the interest of justice with the big picture in mind in terms of what's right for our community, what's right for our community long term, and what's right for our community today.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Christina, for coming by today and making the time to share your views with us and talk to the viewers and tell them what you would do if you're elected to this position.
Thank you, Andrew.
Very important post. The state's attorney has a lot of latitude and leeway about what cases get prosecuted and, kind of how quickly they get adjudicated, I suppose. And so it's a very big and important decision that you voters will be making by November 6th. But again, as we said at the top, you can vote today if you want to, and avoid those long lines at the booth on November 6th. We hope there'll be long lines at the voting booth anyway, because your vote does count, and it's important that you do make your voice heard on November 6th, if not before. Again, thank you for being with us today. Thank you, Ms. Rainville, for joining us today. Really appreciate having you here, and we'll see you all again the next time. Have a great day, everyone.